All right, so let me get it started, and I'm going to jump into a new lecture series today. And
Oh,
as you can see, we got political parties for and against democracy. And I suppose the motivation for this series is reasonably clear. In a week in which Florida passed new legislation to further restrict the access to the ballot, following Georgia, looks like Texas and Ohio are poised to follow suit as well. I'll just start with the basic proposition. There's a political scientist named E. Schattschneider from the middle of the 20th century who said modern democracy is impossible without political parties. And I'm inclined to agree. And so sometimes political parties work and do good work for modern representative democracy. It's hard to conceive of democracy without them. And yet there is the writing of Livitsky and Ziblatt and others who say basically the vast majority of democratic societies that have been overturned over the last 150 years, that have been overthrown, are overthrown from within. Over 90% of them elect a leader who then turns against democracy and tries to hold on to power irrespective of the outcome of the next election, or even by forestalling or preventing the next election, right? And so sometimes democracies are well served by the political parties that compete for power within them, and sometimes those parties turn against democracy. And my concern is obviously that the United States is at a point in its history where at least one of its major parties may in fact be more focused on winning than on upholding or preserving democratic norms. And so that's the jumping off point for the series. Why does that happen? When does that happen? How does that happen? When does it not happen? When do democracies foster healthy, constructive competition between their political parties? And what, if anything, can we do in America in the 21st century to try to encourage our parties to be for democracy and for the common good, even if that means surrendering some of their advantages, being a little bit less instrumental, a little bit less focused on simply winning, and more focused on sustaining the institutional health of the structures in which they compete. So this will be a series of lectures. I'm going to start today with a fair bit of background, and I'm titling today's lecture "Before It Was Cool to Party: Mistrust of the Vicious Arts by Which Elections Are Too Often Carried in Early Modern Democratic Thought." And as you may recognize, that quote is from Madison, from Federalist number 10. He's not, in fact, opposed to parties or factions, as he calls them there, but he is concerned that if institutions don't moderate their tendencies, they will spoil democracy, right? Now, in order to do this, I've got to talk a little bit about what parties mean and what democracy means. And you'll excuse me for being a bit of a political science geek at this point, but I do want to get a little bit of clarity about some terms. And I'm going to start with the idea that it's really hard to define parties and democracy, and that there's actually a whole literature on the fact that certain normative political concepts can't be defined without presupposing controversial theories about those concepts. And so you end up building all of your theory into your definition. And if people don't like your theory, they're not going to like your definition. And so that's part of the reason it's hard to come by good, clear, simple definitions of something like parties or democracy. in addition to that, there's just the huge variety of kinds of political parties that there have been throughout modern democratic history, or the history of modern representative government. And the history of parties goes back to England and the 17th century and the Glorious Revolution and the coming into being of the Whigs as a party that was strongly in favor of parliamentary supremacy, and then the Tories as a party that was more pro-royalist or in favor of the king. But I want to be clear, in a sense, that predates the institutionalization of mass elections by over a century, right? And maybe almost 200 years, really. And so these parties started much more as what are sometimes called legislative clique parties. That is to say, parties that are primarily there to organize the forces within a legislature. And one of the theories, it's actually a quite influential theory about modern political parties, is that if they didn't exist, they very quickly would come into being, if for no other reason than it's impossible to legislate without knowing what your alliances are. If they constantly shift, you're never going to get anything done. You're going to be spending all your time lining up your votes and none of your time legislating. And so within the legislature, before we get out to elections and the rest of society, it does appear that parties play an important role. Now, if we start thinking about it outside of the legislature and in early American history, early 19th century American history, also British history, post-revolutionary French history, a lot of the political parties were so-called parties of notables. And what this means is that they were led by people who gained their stature and prestige independently from the party, and then either came into the party or were recruited by the party in order to lead it, but that they had a status independent of party leadership, that they, in a sense, lended to or loaned to the party, right? And so we can think of Jefferson or Hamilton or Adams in this role, people who had earned their society's respect in the Revolution and the founding and the early years of the Republic, and then assumed leadership positions. A third kind of party, and I hope you'll see how different these things are from each other, is a clientelist or a spoilage party. And this is a party that essentially recruits members by promising to distribute benefits for them if they succeed in taking over the reins of power. And so they treat the government as an opportunity to capture valuable positions, valuable in themselves and valuable for what they can deliver to their supporters. And then it's a very straightforward quid pro quo. We win, you'll get a turkey on Thanksgiving, etc. Right? And so that's a third kind of party that was the dominant kind of party in the United States in the first 2/3 of the 19th century, at least, really throughout much of the 19th century until the progressive reforms occurred. Monopoly parties, and we can think here of China or Russia or Iran, and I'm a little hesitant with John in the audience, but I want to say that Japan was in a sense led by a single party for much of the 20th century. And the idea of a monopoly party is essentially that it will control the state itself. It doesn't have to deal with a rival. Typically, this is undemocratic, right? And so sometimes there's actually rivalry within the single party such that it might institutionalize an effective form of fair competition and electoral politics. But if we're thinking of China, Russia, Iran, clearly we're thinking about parties that attempt to control the state in part to suppress other parties or prevent there from being meaningful leadership challenges, right? And so there's not a constant relationship between democracies and parties. In a sense, that's the whole premise of the course. Ethnic and religious parties, parties organized in societies that are split along ethnic or religious lines that represent one or the other of the ethnic or religious groups. Oftentimes, these are intolerant parties. Oftentimes, these are violent parties. And sometimes this leads into ethnic or religious conflict, violence, or war. Ideological parties, parties that are organized around a clear-cut political philosophy, right? A conservative party, a liberal party, a labor party, a social democratic party. Many of our parties advertise their ideology in their very name and are organized as vehicles for bringing those ideas, the impress of those ideas, to bear on government and policy. And then finally, mass electoral parties, right? These are political parties that compete in mass elections in order to gain the most votes. And please note that mass electoral parties can be ideological parties, or they can be ethnic or religious parties, right? These are not mutually exclusive categories, but this is something of a typology. And I think I actually eliminated the slide. Let me see. Yeah, I did. I had put a slide in that showed you political scientists doing a typology of parties. I'll just point out that I'm simplifying somewhat, that when they do these branches, there are 40 different kinds of parties that they tend to look at. Now, having said all of that, I want to focus on one particular kind of party, and I'm going to call it a common good party. And what distinguishes a common good party is, I think, at least two things. The first is that it wants to abide by democratic norms. You can think here of two different kinds of sports teams. One is a team that only wants to win by the rules, that wants to play the game well, so much better that they run the other team off the field, maybe, right? That they play the beautiful game, but they win within the rules of the game. And part of the point is to win within the rules of the game. The idea is not just to win, but to win by playing well. And a common good party says the point of organizing a political party is to promote the public welfare of the society. And we want to win only if and when we succeed in convincing the public that our policies are better than the alternatives offered by other parties. And then we govern in order to realize those policies, to actually implement them. And when those policies are implemented, it turns out that they are actually good for the society. And if the common good party is in a democracy, it is committed to not only the common good and only winning if it convinces the majority of the common good, but that being a democratic society is part of the common good. And so they want to uphold, maintain, strengthen the institutions of democracy, encourage, for instance, everyone to vote, for elections to be free and open, for the franchise to be widely available. And that the kind of person who supports this kind of party because they believe that it's in the public good might be called, I'm using Russell Muirhead's language here, a high partisan, or someone who engages in high partisanship. And I want to be clear. In the real world, right? Not every party is a common good party. As a matter of fact, it's probably never been the case that there's purely a common good party, right? That most parties do play hardball politics. They do want to win. They do some things that are unfair or underhanded. And that to the extent that voters are high partisans, they're often deluded about what their parties are doing behind the scenes. I will tell you very quickly that my start in politics, almost my end in politics as well, was as a domestic issues advisor to Walter Mondale when he ran for the presidency in 1984. And I idealized Walter Mondale as a lion of the civil rights movement, as a genuinely progressive Democrat, maybe in retrospect as one of the last of his dying breed. And then I got in the same room with Walter Mondale, and let's just say he was a very different person in person than the person I knew from the newspapers and Reputation. And so, yes, sometimes when we are high partisans, we are choosing to see only the good and not the bad in the party that we support. We'll get more into this. This is a typical aspect of what's sometimes called identity protecting cognition. If you strongly identify with your party, you may only want to think that it's able to do good things, and you may not pay sufficient attention to the bad that it does. And I will just say something that I've been thinking a lot about as I've been doing the research for this course, that if we go back into the not too distant past, the Democratic Party, which I think currently is more of a party that is for democracy than the Republican Party in the American landscape, was the opposite, right? It was the party of the Dixiecrats, the party of one state authoritarian racist rule in the South. And even the Northern and the Midwestern and Western Democrats made their peace with the Dixiecrats because it allowed them to retain power, right? And so it's not just present day Republicans. Both parties have had their moments of doing a lot of harm. And so we do have to be careful to not get too identified with our parties, even if what we want is common good parties. All right, having done all of that, can we actually define a party? And here I will point to Schattschneider, and in his 1942 Steady Party Government, he offers this, what I'm calling a usefully vague definition. Can you come up with a definition that incorporates all these different kinds of parties? He says a political party is an organized attempt to get control of government. And I like that definition in part because it allows us to build the big house we need to incorporate all the different kinds of parties, in part because it says, look, political parties are neither good nor bad. What matters is not what they're doing, which is trying to get power. Max Weber says political parties play in the house of power, right? Or live in the house of power. What matters is what they want to do with that power and what constraints, what bounds they recognize in terms of how they're going to compete to get that power. And so it's not the party itself, it's how the party is organized, what its philosophy is, what its means are, what its supporters will tolerate and won't tolerate, what its leaders will countenance and not, in fact, do. All right, so with all of that, I also want to emphasize that these differences between political parties are not determined by the parties themselves, that parties operate in environments that shape them, and those environments vary. And so what are some of the factors that influence the character of parties and partisanship? The first, and I guess probably the most obvious, is the nature of the electoral system itself. And so just to be as clear as possible here, the United States for the last almost 100 years has primarily had one kind of electoral system, especially for national politics. And that is what is referred to as a single member, territorially based, winner take all districting system. And so to be clear, you're voting for Congress. Do you, if you like the candidate in Oregon or Washington, get to choose to vote for them, right? No, you vote only where you live. How many people are running for office? Usually only two. How many people are going to win? Always only one. Winner takes all, single member district. You only get to elect one person, and the first past the post, the person who gets the most votes, gets to represent. And this is not actually the typical electoral system of most of the rest of the world. And it wasn't the only electoral system in the United States throughout most of the 19th century and going all the way back to the founding. We did have often what are called multi-member districts. That is to say, a district where 3 or 5 or 7 people represent that district, and everybody gets 3 or 5 or 7 votes. And the result is of that kind of system that you typically get multiple parties because you can vote for a smaller party without wasting your vote. And so there's this French political scientist in the middle of the 20th century, Maurice Duverger, and Duverger's law says basically the kind of electoral system you have in the United States invariably produces a two-party system. It may be over time that a party will collapse in the way that the Federalists collapsed in the early years of the Republic, or the Whigs collapsed in the middle of the 19th century to be replaced by the Republicans. It could be that a party collapses, but it's going to be replaced by another party, right? That there are short periods in the history of the United States where there are multiple parties, but very quickly we go back to having two dominant parties. And that is because in the kind of electoral system we have, if you vote for a third party, you are almost always wasting your vote. And that may not be clear in the first election you do it, but over time it becomes clear. If you want your vote to actually affect who's going to win the election, you should vote for one of the two leading candidates. And on the other hand, if we have the multi-member districts, then it's much more likely that a third party can actually capture a seat or two, even if it can't capture the majority of the seats, right? And so the electoral system influences the kinds of parties that you have, as does the nature of the cleavages in your society. And by that, I mean the divisions, the main political divisions. And so in Britain in the 19th century, the franchise was restricted for the first 2/3 of the century. And the result is that the competition was really between people who were, generally speaking, from a similar class background, and they fought over ideas. That there were conservative Tories and progressive Whigs. And at some point, the progressive Whigs actually managed to get the franchise expanded so the working class could vote, a bit like what the Democrats did in passing civil rights legislation in the 1960s. The Whigs signed their own death warrant in expanding the vote in the same way that the Democrats essentially ended their competitiveness in the South for several generations. What happened is a new division emerged, as opposed to it being all people from a similar class background fighting over ideas. All of a sudden, the working class emerged, and they said, you know what, we don't feel like the Whigs, thank you very much for getting us the vote, adequately represent us. We want a labor party. We want a working class party. And so through the 20th century, you get a different division. And so that's an indication of the way in which the shift in the division of the society can change the nature of the parties. And obviously, class is one of the ways in which a society can divide. Race is another way, and in these lectures we'll be talking a lot about race and the role that race has played in organizing American partisan competition. Third issue here has to do with whether or not the parties are what are called cross-cutting political parties. And you may recognize this term from Michael Tomasky. The general idea here, and it goes, a good example is mid-20th century America, in which there were both liberal or progressive and conservative Democrats and Republicans. It was not a contradiction in terms to say a conservative Democrat. There were a lot of them in the South, the Blue Dog Democrats, right? And it was not a contradiction in terms to say a liberal Republican. There were a considerable number of them, especially representing the New England states. They would not be Democrats because the Democrats had made their peace with the Dixiecrats. They were more strongly convinced that it was important to pursue an agenda of racial justice, if we use the retrospective vocabulary, and they made their home in the Republican Party as a result. As opposed to cross-cutting parties, you can also have ideologically sorted parties. And these are parties where if you're a liberal, you're in this party. If you're a conservative, you're in that party. If you're a working class, you're in this party. If you're bourgeoisie, you're in that party, right? And so that's another important factor. Does the society sort itself out, or does it intermingle some of its axes of political competition within the same political party? Fourth issue here is whether or not partisanship is the main relevant political identity. And people who do survey research in the United States, and there's actually some innovative techniques looking at political reporting as well, note the identities that used to be used. And so people, when asked what their political identity was, would sometimes say American or citizen, right? An inclusive overall identity. They would sometimes say, I'm a New Englander, or I'm a Californian, or I'm a Southerner, or I'm a Georgian, right? A regional identity. They would sometimes say, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative. They would sometimes say, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, right? And so Democrat and Republican was not the single salient political identity that in a sense signaled all that other stuff. Whereas today it appears much more to be the case that our partisan identities are encompassing political identities. When you tell someone you're a Democrat, they know you're probably not from the South. You're probably not evangelical. You are almost certainly not conservative, right? And so do other political identities compete, or does partisanship really subsume all those identities? All right, when it comes to democracy, and in various ways, I've been talking with you guys about democracy for a very long time. Again, we can try to come up with like a very general, encompassing definition. I can take care of. I can take care of that. Give me 1 second.
I don't know.
Okay, so I have muted everybody. If we're hearing anybody, I think they've unmuted themselves. And you can do that by pushing your spacebar and ask a question at any time you want. Please feel free. So I'm going to point you to Adam Przeworski, who's one of, I think, the most eminent scholars of democracy writing today, professor at NYU. And he has this very minimal, realist, elitist conception of electoral democracy. Democracy is a political arrangement in which people select government through elections and have a reasonable possibility of removing incumbent governments they do not like. So for Przeworski, that's what democracy is. You have regular elections that determines who the leaders are. And if the leaders screw up, you can kick them out. So what are on this account the advantages of democracy? Well, one of them is that it allows for a peaceful transition in power. Right, you get to get a turnover in government without having to have a coup or a civil war or battles in the street. You use so-called paper stones instead, ballots, to fight your political fights. Another big advantage, and Pisorski is Polish. He grew up in a society without regular free open elections and with plenty of bad leaders. And one of the things that Pisorski likes about electoral democracy is if you get an incompetent nincompoop or somebody with authoritarian tendencies or somebody who's too distracted to do the job well or just isn't suited to the times, you can get them out after one term, right? And so it gives you a mechanism for removing bad leaders. And then finally, and in a sense, I think maybe most importantly for Pisorski, it allows you to prevent tyranny from developing, right? The fact that usually there's going to be an alternation between political parties, between leaders. Nobody's going to win again and again and again. Although certainly there are some examples of that in the current world, means that nobody's going to have the capacity to consolidate power in an authoritarian way. All right, so having given you Pisorski's definition of democracy, I just want to point out he leaves a lot out, a lot that many people who like democracy consider to be extremely important about democracy. One thing would be accountability. Is it, enough accountability to just say if they do a bad job, we're going to be able to kick them out? Or do we want a little bit more prospective influence over our politicians? We are suffering from high unemployment or bad healthcare, and we want to set the agenda for you and for you to be accountable to us. And similar to that is the idea of responsiveness, that if our ideas change while you're in government, you need to hear us and respond to us. Another advantage that many people who write about democracy point to is that being a democratic citizen is a badge of equality and inclusion. And democratic societies tend to be committed to the idea that every person who is legally residing in the territory gets citizenship and gets full equal standing within the society. Democratic societies also have a strong claim to legitimacy, and that may be a real advantage. You don't have to only expect that people will obey the law when you're standing there with a baton ready to hit them when they don't, right? They obey the law because they think they own the law, they authored the law, they made or contributed to the law. They have a duty, an inner compunction to follow the law. Another claim often made, especially in contemporary political theory about democracy, is that it is deliberative. And that is to say, it is a form of government in which we debate and argue and listen to and try to convince each other about how to vote and what kind of legislation to adopt. And in the process, we may very well learn from each other, learn about things that we hadn't adequately taken into account, change our minds, and as a result, have better, more rational, more sensitive legislation and policy. Another claim made on behalf of democracy is that democracy tends to be strongly associated with the rule of law, that this is a society that says no person is above the law, and that all laws have to be promulgated and out there for people to see and know before you can coerce them into obeying them, right? Final couple claims about democracy. One of them is that it's a form of government in which we learn from our mistakes, and therefore we tend to make progress. That we are held to account via regular elections, via deliberation within our legislative bodies. If the Capitol Police is poorly organized and unaccountable, and the result is that they don't respond well to a threat, then we hold hearings, figure out what happened, reorganize them, right? If we learn of injustice or malfeasance, we not only try to fix it, repair it, end it, we also try to build our institutions such that it can't be repeated, right? And so another aspect, I think, strongly tied to deliberation, accountability, responsiveness. And then finally, in the accounts of democracy, the richer accounts that I'm offering now, one of the things to notice is that democracy relies not only on elections, but also on the kind of stuff we're doing right now, having political discussions in ordinary daily context, even when there aren't elections immediately on our doorsteps, right? And so that a democracy tends to produce a civil society, a society in which we discuss things and get along with each other, and it also tends to rely on activities that occur in civil society. Now, I am, as I've already said, not going to try to give you a single definition that's an alternative to Przeworski's. That's a good starting place. I just wanted to point out that we might want to include more. My solution in this course for thinking about how to define democracies and parties is to focus on the United States and to focus on really the last 100 years. And I'm going to be quite historical in what I do with you in coming weeks. I want to look at the history of both the Republican and the Democratic Party and how they have changed over the years. Before I do that, I see that I've got a comment in the chat bar, and let me pull out of this so I can see you. Let's see. John Campbell, who's got absolutely no background in political science, says, shouldn't we start with a minimalist definition? So Schumpeter and right, Joseph Schumpeter, who famous for both a minimalist and a realist account of democracy, who basically thought that democracy was an elite game that allowed the people to have the perception of participating, but not really having much capacity to control the government. So Schumpeter defined democracy as the method by which people elect representatives in competitive elections to carry out their will. So I don't even agree with you, John, I have to say. I wouldn't say to carry out their will, right? If I've got Schumpeter right, and I don't want to split hairs with you today, so maybe I should back off of that. But I don't think he thought the people had a will until the representatives told them what their will was. That's part of what made him a realist. But anyway, the more we add, the fewer countries fit the definition, making it less useful. And here John is an empirical political scientist, and I'm a political theorist or philosopher, right? And so my ambition in listing all those other values of a democracy is not to say every democracy realizes all those criteria, but that when people say they want to live in a democracy, they tend to have things like that in mind. But I do agree with your basic instinct here, and I used Przeworski instead of Schumpeter. I could have used Schumpeter as well. Przeworski is more contemporary, but he's in many ways, just repeating what Schumpeter said. I agree. If we just want a definition of democracy in which most of the systems that have applied that label in some credible way to themselves can be incorporated, we got to keep it really minimal, really abstract, rather realist. I just think that when I'm talking about our parties for democracy, part of what I'm saying is, are they for a system of government we would want to live in? and that might include more things than just being elected via freely contested election, right? And in particular, one of the things I'm really going to focus on is what does a freely contested election mean, right? Does it include allowing everyone who might, if they were allowed to vote, run you out of office, right? And so it's worthwhile noting that Schumpeter, writing in the 1950s, thought the United States was a democracy at a point where African Americans were systematically excluded from the franchise in the territories where 80–90% of them lived, right? And so, you know, I guess sometimes being a little bit more rigorous about what we mean about a democracy may have some advantages as well. All right, John, you want to come back at me on that? Okay, all right. I'll get back to it then, unless there are any other questions or thoughts at this juncture. Let me get into the substance of what I want to say to you today. What I want to do in particular is a little bit of a history of ideas about democracy, and I'm sorry, really about parties. And so I'm going to start where this country started in the 18th century, and with skepticism about political parties. And I'm going to share a couple quotes with you, and their style perhaps reflects the style and character of the people who wrote them as well. The first is from George Washington, in all its turgid glory, his farewell address. He says, "Partisans put in place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternative triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction." And I just want to underline for a moment, this term faction in 18th century political thought is almost synonymous with party. I think we don't think of it in that way anymore. I think we tend to think of a faction as a subgroup of a party, and to still hear some of the negative connotations, which we no longer perhaps hear when we hear the term party. But for the 18th century political vocabulary, party was as bad a word as faction was, right? Rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interest. So that's George Washington in his farewell address. And I think it's worthwhile noting, we know that actually he asked Alexander Hamilton to draft these portions of his address, and that Hamilton was in the process of organizing something that would later come to be called the Federalist Party, right? And this is the irony here, is that I've got two quotes for you. The second one is much easier. It's from Thomas Jefferson, a letter that he wrote to Francis Hopkins in 1789, when he said, "If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all." Right? Much more succinct. And you know, Jefferson may not be the most religious man in the world, but that was his very strong way of saying, I don't want to be president if the only way to be president is with a party. And of course, Jefferson organizes the first major rival party in the United States, right? Hamilton organizes the Federalists, Jefferson organizes the so-called Democratic Republicans. And so the irony is that these are, in fact, men who turn out to be partisans. Why do they turn out to be partisans? Because they care about politics, because they want to influence the future direction of the country, because they don't think the direction that it's heading in is necessarily the best direction. And this gets at the problem with trying to be non partisan or post-partisan is that it's really hard to be effective in political life. But before we get to that, let me just point out to you the kind of two grounds I think that were most important in accounting for 18th century skepticism about political parties. One of them is the idea that the common good is actually something that each and every one of us should be able to reason out on our own. And that if we're being impartial, open minded, honest, putting our self interest to one side or the particular religion or other uh, biased, prejudicing perspective, we'll all be able to come to a consensus. We don't need a party to organize us. Our reason should take us to the same destination in politics. And in part, this reflects the fact that it was a simpler time than it is now. But in part, frankly, it reflects the fact that there was very little experience with democracy until the 19th century, when the US and France and Britain started trying to use modern representative democracy to govern its affairs, and quickly discovered, guess what? Not all good people come to the same conclusion about the common good, even if they are being reasonable, rational, impartial, and open-minded. The second idea, and it's very much the flip side of the first, is that if you join a party, you are joining a group of people who cares more about winning power or capturing government to capture the resources it contains, or their religion or their class position, than they do about the common good. Why else would you get together with a subset of the citizens and organize to vanquish the rest of them, except that you have some partial interest, some interest that is different from the common good that you want to bring to bear using the instruments of the state and coercion so that others can't object or resist, right? And so back to, right, Madison's talking about the low arts in which elections are won. The idea is that in essence, when you form a party, you get together to deceive the people about what their good is. If you don't have parties, each of them will reason clearly and conscientiously on their own and get to the right conclusion. And it's a nice theory. And as a matter of fact, the more I think about it, the more I'm attracted to the idea that there are intrinsic problems with partisanship. But that doesn't mean that we can do without political parties. As much or as nice, as much as we might wish, as nice as it would be if we could, that just doesn't seem to be the world we live in. And so now let me transition to the rehabilitation of parties. In 20th century political science, starting with people like Woodrow Wilson, and then the great E.E. Schattschneider, even Schumpeter, and a whole body of mid-20th century, primarily American political science, basically came to the conclusion that political parties created democracy, and modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties, as Schattschneider put it in language that kind of crystallized this consensus in the 1940s. And when we look at the more specific functions that the people who rehabilitated parties thought that parties played, I think 5 stand out. One is that when they're well structured, political parties put elites and ordinary citizens in touch with each other, so that elites are forced to pay attention to ordinary citizens, and ordinary citizens can be educated by people who specialize in politics when their views are ill-informed or naive, right? So we need the representative and the representatives to be in contact with each other. And you can see in Washington's quote a little bit of fudging, the delegated will of the nation that is the consistently digested by common councils. Where does that will of the nation come from? How do the elites know what it is if there's not some institution that puts them in contact with the people? When well-organized political parties do that. Political parties have also been, not recently, but in many places and many periods, civil society organizations. That is to say, not just organizations that ask you to write a check every now and then to vote for a candidate, but that actually do things that involve you in your neighborhood, in your precinct, ask you to come to meetings, potentially recruit you to be a candidate for a local office. And that if democracy is simply the rule of distant elites, many of us will feel powerless, apathetic, left out. And if there's an opportunity for us to come together and participate, even if it's at a low level in an ordinary neighborhood meeting, that may lead us to feel more powerful, better organized, better connected with each other. Political parties for much of the 19th century, some of the 20th century, did this work. In addition to that, they also did the work of political socialization, of training new citizens, of recruiting, but also in acculturating potential leaders, explaining to us what is required to participate in democracy as a good citizen, to have fidelity to the basic norms of constitutional democracy. And I would point out to you that this kind of political socialization is necessary in at least two cases. One of them is just with each rising generation. Who's going to teach them about politics, about citizenship, about the issues? And the political parties have been very important in doing that. And the second is, especially in the United States as an immigrant society, if you have people coming to the country who have not had that experience with democracy, who's going to socialize them? And it may seem strange to us today, but local Democratic and Republican clubs in the second half of the 19th century did an awful lot of work with immigrants, training them for citizenship. The fourth idea here is mobilizing citizens for participation and helping them to make political choices. And I know I'm speaking to you in California. I myself vote sometimes in California. You get the ballot in California, and what do you see, right? 60 different offices, right? With 120 people. It would be impossible. I shouldn't say impossible. It would be a full-time job to be up to speed on every one of those individuals, all of the initiatives, et cetera, right? And for the most part, many of us know the people who are running for the prominent offices, for the president, for the Senate, for our local congressperson, maybe for the state assembly, maybe for the mayor. But when it comes down to judicial elections, school board elections, sometimes we just have to trust that person probably wouldn't have got the Democratic nomination were it not for the fact that they are someone who kind of represents the views I believe in as a Democrat, or got the Republican nomination if they weren't like me, if I'm a Republican, right? And so it helps to simplify and make tractable political choice in a circumstance in which things have gotten very complicated. There's so many positions, so many issues that we would be cognitively overloaded if we tried to make sense of all of them in the absence of some leadership by our parties. Final good function that political parties play is allowing us to hold accountable for bad decisions or reward for good decisions, not just this or that individual right? We might not have a Democrat representing us in Southern Texas, but if we like what the Democratic president has done or what a Democratic Congress has done, that means something about who we should vote for in the next election, right? And so it helps us to determine who's responsible for what went right or wrong, and then to make judgments about who we should support in future elections. Now, I've told a kind of two-step story here, right? Initial suspicion about parties, growing understanding of the significance, the importance, and the good roles that parties play. This is not the end of the story. And I'll conclude here today with one more idea, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but that is that in the 21st century, over really the last 30 years, there's been growing recognition that we live in a more polarized era, that there's more so-called negative partisanship, not positive partisanship, not running on the basis of the value of the policy proposals and platform that your party has, but running against the other party. And that as negative partisanship and polarization and hyper-partisanship have taken hold, it perhaps has interfered with political parties being able to play some of those good roles, and that a kind of moderated or bounded partisan competition allows the parties to play those roles. The extreme competition that we see in the 21st century has made it difficult for parties to play those roles. And so this is where we'll be going next week and in subsequent weeks, is looking in much more detail at the forces producing hyper partisanship and polarization in the 21st century, what we can do to moderate them, but also more generally thinking about the history of political parties. When does this occur? When doesn't this occur? I've got a comment from David. How can we talk about free and fair elections with such a focus on funding and re-election and dark money? And that does, so to be clear, I'm not saying that contemporary American elections are free and fair. I'm saying that democracy requires free and fair elections. And I should have added, right, in my list of factors that influence the nature of a party system, I said the electoral system, right? And then I started talking about electoral districting and different kinds of districting. Certainly, the rules that regulate the funding of parties, the rules that regulate the timing of elections, how long does an election cycle last, the rules that regulate the kinds of primaries you have. And please note that a lot of the money actually goes into the primaries, and that seems to, given gerrymandering or the protection of the incumbent party in the way in which we district, that tends to be where the action is in American electoral politics these days. So if you can influence who wins the primary, you influence the overall ideological direction of the party. So yes, absolutely. I'm not saying we have free and fair elections. I'm saying we are democratic to the extent that we approximate the ideal of free and fair elections, among other things. Thank you for the comment, David. Anybody else with a thought or a comment? I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone. Please note that your background noise will pick up now. So if we can try to keep it down for the next few minutes. Who wants to start us out? David, you have a follow-up. Go ahead.
Yes, this is another question. When we're talking about basic tenets of democracy, or a basic agreement on, as I look at what's going on now, that does not exist either. So there's almost this wild disconnect for me between what we're talking about and what I see going on.
Well, and so maybe I'll ask you to be a little bit more specific. What is it that you see going on? And I'm happy to admit that I'm not describing what's going on in America today. I'm laying the foundation for trying to do that in subsequent lectures, but also for being historical about it. And so, like I said, one of the things that I really, in a sense, had to swallow hard to get my head around in this, doing the work to prepare this lecture series, and I knew this, but there's knowing and there's knowing, is remembering that the Democratic Party was from the 1870s to the 1960s doing a lot of stuff that looks an awful lot like what the Republican Party is doing today in terms of keeping people from voting. And in fact, it was doing it in much more vile, violent, thorough, and effective ways than the Republicans are today. But so David, I'm sorry, go ahead. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not trying to find the good guys and the bad guys. To me, if what we want is our democracy to work, what I see going on, there's no common agreement. First of all, the whole thing about money and all that, there is no representative government, virtually, as I see it. None of this bodes well for the democracy. That's all.
Okay, and so let me then circle back to this idea of hyper-partisanship and polarization. And part of what I would suggest is that if you want parties to play the good roles that they potentially play in supporting democracy, probably you don't want hyper-partisanship. And part of what hyper-partisanship says is, my side has a monopoly on what's true or good or just or sane, and the other side, they're all bastards that are out to get us in any way that they can, right? And if you're, you know, if you can't acknowledge, and not just as a kind of psychological accomplishment, but because it's true that the other side is acting in good faith, that you may not agree with them and they may not agree with you, but these are the kinds of differences of opinion that actually make democracy vital and vibrant and capable of learning and generating more encompassing policy. Then you're probably in trouble. And by the way, once you start thinking of the other side as just your political enemies, right? And one of the statistics or one of the facts I love here is that Americans now are much more willing to have their children marry somebody of a different religion or a different race than they are a different party, right? So that helps you to see the degree of animus that we have for each other across party lines. That if that's where you are, then it's not surprising that politics increasingly becomes a no-holds-barred sport. It's going to be an absolute disaster if they win. We've got to do everything in our power to prevent that, right? And that doesn't include, it doesn't support fidelity to democracy. It goes back to your first question, free and fair elections. If that means they win and they're going to put an authoritarian leader or a socialist leader in place, then no, we just got to win any way we can. The country is at stake. This is not ordinary politics. This is something more akin to civil war, right? And so yes, so when we're and we're not there yet, but the direction we're moving in, if you play it out another few elections, we are moving in that direction. And so part of, right, the thinking about this series of lectures I want to give is, can we figure out how to change course?
David,
Lucy? Yeah, go ahead, please.
what worries me is that you are teaching us American history again. And I thank you for that. And what worries me is that the people who are now asking for leadership are not only ignorant, they have no idea what they're talking about. It's fantasy and myth. And so I'm waiting to hear from our later Minister of Education, not necessarily Mrs. Biden, but someone who can say something about what we teach and why we teach. That's what I'm hoping for. One, it's a beginning, but the ignorance spouting, pouring out of these people who are making our rules,
Yeah.
they're idiots. I beg your pardon.
Yes, and we have a long, proud tradition of skepticism about intellectuals and academics in this country, of trusting common folk and common judgment. And I do think that there's something actually admirable about that. But if it leads you to forget history, or
Yes.
or to propagate lies, or to disregard science, right? Then again, we're in trouble. And so I want to be clear, right? You know, I love talking with you guys. I organize my weeks so I can be available to you on Saturdays. I don't think we're actually going to change the world by getting things right. It's a starting point, right? And we're not probably going to be able to change the mind of the leadership of the Republican Party, or to make them aware of the history they seem so hell-bent on sweeping under the rug, to say the least, right? I mean, you look at Liz Cheney, and all you got to do is say one dissident thing, and they're running you out of your leadership position, right?
Yes.
So I'm working on this. Hopefully, by the time we're through with this lecture series, I will be in a better position to be more concrete with you. But I do think it's in part not just about the bad people who are in leadership positions in different parties. It's about the incentive structures, right? And the way in which, if you don't do the strategic competitive thing, you get punished in a hyper-partisan environment and replaced by somebody who is more of a bastard with elbows than you were, right? And I certainly hope that the Democrats don't mirror back to the Republicans what they're doing right now. But I think, in a sense, it's inevitable in the long term, if the Republican Party continues to play this game, that the Democrats will start playing it back. So yes, we need a strong sense of history. We need a strong set of political ethics to guide us. And that's in part what I hope to be able to talk through with you in the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Suzanne, go ahead. I think you're muted.
Whoops.
There you go.
I was just struck by what you said about the line between politics and civil war being very thin. We tend to look down on countries that are involved in civil war, but really, how far away are we from that?
Yeah, I hear you, and obviously,
Especially now.
what happened on January 6th is worrisome. I take some solace in the fact that it was only maybe 1,000 people out of a country of, you know, hundreds of millions. But having said that, the way in which this idea that the election was stolen, that Joe Biden couldn't possibly have won, and then the effort to change the election laws, right? And again, I forget his name, but the local speaker of the House of Ohio saying, oh, there wasn't any fraud that we can document, but you don't know what you don't know, right? Therefore, we better pass this legislation that's going to make it more difficult to vote. And we all know who they're targeting and why. And so if a political party becomes a minority party, right, and still wants to hang on to power and doesn't see any path to creating a majority coalition, then its incentives are guiding them, right? And that's why I'm focusing on incentives, right? It's not just that these are bad people making bad choices. This is a structural problem that is generating hyperpolarization in the United States today. And so, yes, Suzanne, I do think we are, to go back to language I've used with you before, an increasingly fractured society. And it's just such a shame, given how many resources, how much potential this country has, that we're at this point, at this moment in our history. All right, everybody. Good getting to be with you this morning. Anne, are you trying to speak? No, okay. I saw your light up for a second. We will continue. We'll do more history, more sociology together next week, getting a little bit more realistic about how political parties actually operate. Take care. See you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Bye, guys.
David.
Thank you, guys. Be good. Be safe. Say it again. Okay. See you next week.
Next week. Take care.
Bye-bye.